The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk of 5th and Main Street. Detective Samuel Briggs, though he hadn't been called that in 15 years, shuffled slowly down the familiar downtown corridor, his weathered hands gripping the handles of an old military duffel bag. His gray beard caught the dying light as he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely solved anything. The streets he walked had changed dramatically since his retirement. New glass buildings reached toward the sky where old brick shops once stood. The corner deli where he used to grab coffee during his patrol days had been replaced by a trendy cafe with prices that would have made his younger self laugh. But the essence of the neighborhood remained. The same mix of hurried commuters, street vendors, and the occasional person who seemed to have nowhere particular to go. Samuel had been one of New York's finest for 32 years. He'd walked these very streets as a rookie in 1972, fresh-faced and eager to make a difference. Back then, the city was grittier, more dangerous, but somehow more honest about what it was. He'd seen it all. Domestic disputes that turned violent, gang wars that left children orphaned, corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government. Through it all, he'd maintained his integrity, earning the respect of his colleagues and the grudging admiration of even those he'd arrested. The Medal of Valor in his bag was a testament to one particular night in 1985. A warehouse fire had trapped 3 children on the 2nd floor, and Samuel had been the first to arrive on scene. Without waiting for backup or the fire department, he'd climbed through a window and carried each child to safety, suffering second-degree burns on his arms and back in the process. The newspapers had called him a hero, but Samuel had always insisted he was just doing his job. Now at 73, he walked these streets as a stranger. His worn coat, the same one he'd bought during his final year on the force, hung loose on his diminished frame. Age had been kinder to him than it was to many of his former colleagues, but it had still taken its toll. His once broad shoulders now curved inward, and his confident stride had become more of a careful shuffle. As he passed the bus stop near the corner, Samuel noticed a young woman clutching her purse tighter and glancing nervously in his direction. He'd seen that look before. The suspicious eyes, the way people seemed to assess him as a potential threat rather than a protector. It was one of the cruelest ironies of aging. The same man who had once made people feel safer now made them uncomfortable simply by existing in their space. A businessman in an expensive suit walked past, speaking loudly into his phone about quarterly projections and market volatility. He gave Samuel a wide berth, as if poverty might be contagious. Samuel had arrested men like this businessman years ago, white-collar criminals who stole millions with the stroke of a pen, while looking down on street-level thieves who took $20 from a corner store. The weight of the duffel bag seemed to increase with each step. Inside, wrapped carefully in an old towel, were the accumulated memories of his career. His badge polished to a mirror shine despite its age. Commendations from grateful families. A photograph of his academy graduation class. So many young faces, so many who hadn't made it to retirement. Letters from children he'd helped, some now adults with children of their own. Samuel had originally planned to donate these items to the police museum, but something had changed his mind. Perhaps it was the recent news coverage of police misconduct, or maybe it was simply the realization that his era of law enforcement, built on community trust and personal relationships, seemed as distant as another century. Instead, he decided to leave his mementos at the memorial for fallen officers downtown, a final acknowledgement of the men and women who had given everything for the job. As he waited for the light to change at the intersection, Samuel overheard a conversation between two teenagers about a recent shooting in the neighborhood. They spoke with the casual familiarity of people who had grown up with violence as background noise. He remembered when a shooting would have been front-page news, when the entire precinct would have worked around the clock to solve it. Now it seemed like just another statistic in an endless cycle of tragedy. The light changed, and Samuel continued his slow progress toward the memorial. He passed a group of construction workers on their lunch break, their hard hats and safety vests bright against the concrete landscape. One of them, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and tired eyes, nodded respectfully as Samuel passed. There was something in that nod, a recognition of shared experience perhaps, or simply the courtesy of one working man to another. The memorial was still 6 blocks away, but Samuel's journey was about more than just the destination. Each step was a meditation on a life spent in service to others, a final patrol through the streets he had sworn to protect. The bag contained more than just memorabilia. It held the weight of every decision he'd made, every life he'd touched, every moment when he'd stood between order and chaos. As he turned onto Hudson Street, Samuel noticed a small crowd gathered outside a convenience store. A young mother was crying while holding a toddler, and an elderly store clerk was gesturing animatedly. Samuel's instincts, honed by decades of experience, immediately kicked in. Someone had been robbed, probably just minutes earlier. In his younger days, he would have approached immediately, badge in hand, ready to take control of the situation. But now, he was just another old man with a bag, powerless to help in any official capacity. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career building trust with the community, only to find himself on the outside, looking in during his golden years. He stood at the edge of the crowd for a moment, watching as a patrol car arrived and 2 young officers began taking statements. They were efficient and professional, but Samuel could see they lacked the easy rapport with the witnesses that came from years of walking the same beat. The senior of the 2 officers, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a confident bearing, reminded Samuel of his former partner, Detective Maria Santos. Maria had been killed in the line of duty just 2 years before Samuel's retirement, gunned down during a routine traffic stop that had gone wrong. Her death had haunted him through his final years on the force, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could change. Samuel adjusted his grip on the duffel bag and continued walking. The memorial was close now, just 3 more blocks. He could see the spire of the church where the annual ceremony for fallen officers was held, where families gathered each year to remember those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Samuel had attended every ceremony since his retirement, standing in the back, his presence a quiet tribute to the colleagues he'd lost. The neighborhood began to change as he approached the memorial. The commercial buildings gave way to older residential structures, brownstones that had survived urban renewal and gentrification. It was in one of these buildings that Samuel had made his first arrest as a rookie, a domestic violence call that had escalated when the husband had pulled a knife. Samuel had talked the man down, probably saving at least 1 life that night, maybe more. As he walked, Samuel thought about the young officers he'd seen at the convenience store. They were doing their job, following procedures, documenting everything properly. But something was missing. The intuitive understanding of human nature that came from years of experience. The ability to read a situation and know instinctively how to respond. These skills couldn't be taught in the academy. They had to be learned through countless encounters with people at their best and worst moments. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the street. Samuel paused at a bench outside a small park, the same park where he used to bring his daughter when she was young. Rachel was grown now, living in California with her own family, too busy with her career to visit her aging father very often. She tried to convince him to move to a retirement community, somewhere safer and more comfortable, but Samuel couldn't imagine living anywhere else. This city, with all its problems and contradictions, was part of him in a way that was impossible to explain to someone who hadn't dedicated their life to serving it. Every street corner held a memory, every building a story. The crack house he'd helped shut down that became a community center. The empty lot where children now played, once the site of a double homicide that had taken him months to solve. As Samuel rose from the bench and prepared to continue his journey, he noticed a young man watching him from across the street. The man's posture was tense, his eyes darting nervously between Samuel and the surrounding area. Samuel's trained eye immediately cataloged the details. The bulge in the man's jacket that suggested a weapon, the way he kept his hands hidden, the careful distance he maintained while still keeping Samuel in sight. For a moment, Samuel considered his options. He could approach the man directly, relying on his years of experience to defuse whatever situation might be developing. Or he could simply continue walking, trusting that his instincts might be wrong, that the man was just another resident of the neighborhood going about his business. The decision was made for him when the young man suddenly crossed the street, his hand moving towards his jacket. Samuel stood perfectly still, his body language non-threatening, but alert. The man approached slowly, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "You don't belong here, old man," the young man said, his voice tight with tension. "This isn't your neighborhood anymore." Samuel looked at him with the calm expression of someone who had faced down far more dangerous situations. "I've been walking these streets for 50 years, son. I think I know where I belong." The young man's hand remained near his jacket, but something in Samuel's tone seemed to give him pause. Perhaps it was the absolute lack of fear in the old man's voice, or maybe it was the quiet authority that Samuel still carried despite his age. Whatever the reason, the tension in the air began to dissipate. "Just keep walking," the young man said finally, stepping back, "and don't come back." Samuel nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged the warning without accepting it. He adjusted his grip on the duffel bag and continued toward the memorial, leaving the young man standing on the corner. The encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had reminded Samuel of why he'd chosen to dedicate his life to law enforcement. Not for the excitement or the power, but for the chance to stand between order and chaos, to be the thin blue line that protected the innocent from those who would do them harm. The memorial was visible now, a modest granite monument surrounded by a small garden. Fresh flowers had been placed at its base, probably by family members of the officers whose names were carved into the stone. Samuel recognized many of those names, colleagues who had died in the line of duty, friends who had paid the ultimate price for their commitment to justice. As he approached the memorial, Samuel noticed he wasn't alone. A woman in her 50s was kneeling beside one of the flower arrangements, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She looked up as Samuel approached, her eyes red with tears. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to stand. "I didn't mean to." "Please," Samuel said gently, "don't apologize. You have every right to be here." The woman looked at him more carefully, taking in his weathered appearance and the duffel bag in his hands. Were you on the force?" Samuel nodded. 32 years. Just came to pay my respects." "My husband is on the wall," the woman said, gesturing toward the memorial. "Detective Paul Morrison. He was killed 3 years ago." Samuel's expression softened. He remembered Morrison, a dedicated officer who had been gunned down during a bank robbery. The entire department had attended his funeral, a sea of blue uniforms stretching for blocks around the cathedral. "Paul was a good man," Samuel said. "I worked with him on a few cases. He talked about you and the kids constantly." The woman's tears began to flow again, but they seemed different now, less bitter, more healing. "Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I feel like everyone's forgotten him, like his sacrifice doesn't matter anymore." "It matters," Samuel said firmly. "Every single name on that wall matters. The city is safer because of what they did, even if people don't always recognize it." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people united by their connection to the thin blue line. The woman eventually wiped her eyes and began to gather her things, but before leaving she turned back to Samuel. "What's in the bag?" she asked gently. Samuel looked down at the duffel bag, then back at the memorial. "Memories, mostly. My badge, some commendations, pictures from the old days. I thought I'd leave them here, with the others." The woman smiled through her tears. "Paul would have liked that. He always said the force was like a family, that we all look out for each other even after we're gone." After she left, Samuel was alone with the memorial. He knelt beside it, his old knees protesting the movement, and carefully opened the duffel bag. One by one, he removed the items inside, his badge still gleaming despite its age, photographs of his academy class, and various crime scenes, commendations from grateful citizens, even a small American flag that had been folded with military precision. He arranged them carefully around the base of the memorial, creating a small shrine to his years of service. The Medal of Valor he placed directly beneath the carved names of his fallen colleagues, a final tribute to the men and women who had given everything for the job they all loved. As Samuel stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, he felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life since retirement. The weight of the duffel bag was gone, both literally and figuratively. He had passed the torch to a new generation of officers, trusting them to carry on the traditions of service and sacrifice that had defined his career. The sun was setting behind the downtown skyline, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Samuel took one last look at the memorial, now adorned with the artifacts of his service, and began the long walk home. He moved with a lighter step now, unburdened by the weight of his past, but enriched by the knowledge that his contribution to the force would be remembered alongside those of his fallen colleagues. As he walked, Samuel thought about the young officers he'd seen earlier, the ones who had responded to the robbery call with such professional efficiency. They were the future of law enforcement, and despite the challenges they would face, he had faith in their ability to serve and protect with the same dedication that had characterized his own career. The The streets were quieter now, the business district emptying as people headed home to their families. Samuel walked slowly, savoring these final moments of his unofficial last patrol. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to make a difference in the world. But tonight, he was content to be just another old man walking home through the streets he had spent his life protecting. The memorial faded into the distance behind him, but Samuel carried its spirit with him. The knowledge that service to others was the highest calling, and that every act of courage, no matter how small, contributed to the greater good. He had been a guardian of the peace for 32 years, and though his watch was officially over, the values he had sworn to uphold would continue to guide him for whatever time remained. In the gathering dusk, Detective Samuel Briggs disappeared into the golden light of evening, his quiet legacy finally acknowledged and his long journey of service complete. The badge and medals he had left behind would weather the seasons alongside the memorial itself, a permanent reminder that heroism often comes not with fanfare and recognition, but with the quiet dignity of a life spent in service to others. The city around him continued its eternal rhythm, traffic lights changing, people hurrying home, the distant sound of sirens responding to new emergencies. And somewhere in that vast urban landscape, young officers were walking their beats, carrying forward the traditions of courage and dedication that Samuel and his generation had established. The thin blue line endured, passed from one generation to the next, an unbroken chain of service that would continue long after the last echo of Samuel's footsteps had faded into the night.